Hello and welcome to the Crowley ISD PLC Curriculum Preview for the first 6 weeks for 6th grade. I am Felicia Wilkerson, the Elementary ELAR and Social Studies Coordinator. I look forward to working with teachers and instructional leaders throughout the school year. Please feel free to communicate with me for any questions or for additional support. Unit 1, Exploring Poetry and Literary Nonfiction, is taught during the first 6 weeks. Please pause for a moment to review the Unit 1 Local Assessment Blueprints. 20 instructional days will be utilized for Unit 1. The district has allowed for 3 days at the beginning of the 6 weeks to allow for beginning of year procedures. For Unit 1A, Poetry, the instructional days are August 28th through September 9th. The assessment will be posted for printing on September 8th and should be assessed on September 10th. For Unit 1B, Literary Nonfiction, the instructional days are September 11th through September 25th. As per the local assessment guidelines, teachers are to administer unit assessments within 3 school days upon completion of the unit. Materials you will need for this curriculum preview are the Unit 1 IFD, the organizing instruction using text standard types document, what we will call the content builder, and the PLC for the reading PLC document. For this curriculum preview, I will identify curriculum hotspots and provide close reading strategies that will include the 5S strategy for poetry analysis, TPCast, Say, Mean, Matter. I will model and lead you through an analysis of the cognitive complexity, content, and context complexity of the readiness standard. I will provide seed discussion questions for your PLC as a model of how to focus on learning in your PLC. I will model how to complete the content builder and the PLC for the reading PLC for readiness standards 6.4 figure 19D and F along with 6.8A. You will analyze the readiness standards on the IFD to gain a deeper understanding of how to use the standards to focus on learning. The seed questions that will drive this curriculum preview PLC will be the 4 essential guiding questions to focus on learning. What do we expect all students to learn? How will we know if they learned it? How will we respond to students who don't learn? And how will we enrich those who do learn? Take a moment to look at the Grade 6 heat map by standard. Since Unit 1 begins with poetry and literary nonfiction, we'll go ahead and look at those standards. We see that there's improvement needed in 6.4 figure 19D. This is a tested supporting standard, so we will consider it a hotspot. Therefore, the knowledge and skill statement of 6.4 plus figure 19D is our hotspot. This standard is more complex because of the different levels of specificity. The level of Bloom's is applying, analyzing, and evaluating. Figure 19F is a tested readiness standard. Student performance in this area has declined for the 3-year reporting period. We will consider this also when planning. Finally, look at 6.8A. Notice that it is green. 6.8A is a readiness standard tested across literary genres because sensory and figurative language is used across genres. Since we are in poetry, we know we must incorporate this as well. Students have not made the needed gains to show proficiency in this area. So the heat map shows us what we need to target for poetry, making inferences about the structure and elements of poetry, making connections, and explaining how authors create meaning through sensory and figurative language. So now that we have identified our hotspots as 6.4, figure 19D and F, and 6.8A, let's focus on learning by first studying these texts and pause to discuss the first essential question. Please locate figure 19D on your IFD. Please pause the video to allow everyone to turn to their IFD, and you will want to take notes for the next portion of the video. To set a purpose for reading, when we study a standard or a bundle of standards, we read with this question in mind. What do we want our students to learn? To focus on learning, start by studying the standard to answer the first essential question. I will model for you how to thoroughly analyze the depth of knowledge on the IFD for Figure 19D. Figure 19D reads, make inferences about text and use textual evidence to support understanding. Now let's look in the second column, which is the unit level of specificity. The verb is make. This is the cognitive expectation for students. However, we cannot assume the level of blooms exclusively based on this verb. We must also consider the context for the levels of specificity, because that can increase the complexity of the inferences students need to make. Next, we have the content. This is what we teach. Here it's inferences about text. So far we know that we want students to learn how to make inferences about text. Let's read the context to see to what depth and complexity. So the final portion tells us how and in what context students are expected to make inferences. The context adds complexity and specificity to the cognitive expectation. We see that students are expected to learn how to make inferences related to structural and literary elements of poetry, sensory and figurative language used in poetry, and the purpose of the elements and the purpose of the language used in sections of the poetry or in specific sentences or lines. And they're to make these inferences and use text evidence to support their understanding. So now that we have a clear understanding of Figure 19D, refer to the note in the middle. It says to refer to the specificity of the knowledge and skill statement for each literary genre for additional information on inferring in each type of literary text. So let's go to the knowledge and skill statement for poetry. 6.4 is the knowledge and skill statement for poetry. It reads, students understand, make inferences, and draw conclusions about the structure and elements of poetry and provide evidence from text to support their understanding. Notice the different cognitive expectations. Understand, make inferences, draw conclusions. The content is what we teach. Here, we're teaching the structure of poetry and the elements of poetry. Students must understand, make inferences, and draw conclusions about the structure and elements of poetry, about the whole poem, sections of the poem, particular techniques used in the poem. And these inferences must provide text evidence to support their understanding. The star note on the IFD tells us that this knowledge and skill statements may be assessed with Figure 19D and or E. Let's review 6.8. When studying your standards, it's important to read the knowledge and skill statement along with the student expectation. 6.8 is the knowledge and skill statement, and 6.8a is the student expectation. Notice the different cognitive levels. The content of 6.8 includes sensory language, imagery, stylistic elements, and figurative language. The level of blooms are different as well. 6.8 requires students to make inferences related to sensory and figurative language, whereas 6.8a requires students to explain how the authors created meaning using the elements and language. Both of these are higher order thinking skills. According to the standards we have studied, what do we want our students to learn, and how will we make it relevant and rigorous for them? Take a moment to clearly answer question 1. This will be the focus for student learning statement. Then collaborate about how you can make the learning relevant and rigorous for students. Please pause the video at this time for discussion and to write the answer to question 1. Question 2. How will we know the students learned? This is what we look for in everyday instruction, the knowing. Do students know and can they demonstrate their learning to the depth and complexity of the standard? As we use the content builder, let's build our plan for learning with this question in mind. To utilize the content builder, it's important to understand the framework of it. The process standards for ELAR are the Figure 19 standards. The Figure 19 standards that students use to gain access and learn concepts for 6th grade are using context to determine and clarify the meaning of words, along with Figure 19A, B, and C. The content area concepts are the readiness standards, The scaffolds of learning are the supporting standards that are the basic skills students need to understand and master the readiness standards. The final process standards are the Figure 19 standards that students can use as ways to demonstrate that they can proficiently apply the content area concepts. The ways to show standards are Figure 19, D, E, and F. Now it's time to build an instructional plan that works. I will model for you how to use the Content Builder to plan for learning. To start using the Content Builder, begin with placing your readiness standard in the Readiness Standards section indicated by green. I've placed 6.4 Figure 19D and 6.8 in the Readiness Standard because these two go hand in hand and this is what we want our students to learn. Next, I want to stop and think about which Figure 19 process standards will give students access to learning the concepts and contents. Students need to use context to figure out the meaning of words, ask questions, and monitor their comprehension. The supporting standard that supports the readiness standards I've addressed is 6.4a, Explain Figurative Language. This is a prerequisite skill, and you may need to spiral this into your lesson. Do you see on the side where it supports Figure 19, D, and E? And finally, students will demonstrate their learning when they show that they can make inferences about text with text evidence, about the elements and structure of poetry, as well as summarize logically, and even make connections with Figure 19F. Let's revisit question number 2. Using what we know about the process standards, we can now compose a response to this essential question. How will we know the students learn? And how will we gauge if students know and can demonstrate their learning to the depth and complexity of the standard? Please pause the video to discuss and write your response to this question. Remember that the supporting standards are the scaffolds of learning. They are those prerequisite skills the students need to begin learning the standard. If students are successful at learning the large concepts or they have gaps that you need to attend to, start with what they may already know and if needed, begin interventions with these standards. Discuss the following question and what it may look like on your campus. How will we provide students with additional time and support in a timely, directive, and systematic way when students experience difficulty? Please pause the video at this time to allow for discussion. The fourth essential question to focus on learning is how do we enrich those who do learn? This question addresses the need to enrich students who are learning and take their learning to a higher level. Teachers can differentiate content and process where all students are reading text but vary the particular text to match their reading level. You can differentiate the how by using learning centers to differentiate instruction based on student readiness level. Or differentiate how by providing deeper levels of reading by setting more in-depth purposes for reading. For a PLC to successfully focus on learning, as a collaborative team, it's important to begin by aligning your understanding of the standard you're teaching. That is the verb plus the skill plus the context in the knowledge and skill statement as well as in the student expectation in order to reach the depth and complexity of each standard. The team should agree on what students must be able to do to demonstrate mastery of the standard. The team must align their understanding of the prerequisite skills, those supporting standards, to know where your instruction must begin. Teachers should constantly check for understanding through individual formative assessment frequently to drive their instruction. And teachers should collect and review data to make instructional decisions about students and their instruction. And teams should continuously use assessment data to make adjustments to instructional plans. I will model for you how to use the PLC for the Reading PLC tool. So first you want to start out with your unit. And of course we're in poetry. You'll choose the type of poem. Next you want to think about your content builder and think about the cognitive expectations, that is the thinking required of students in order to master the content. So here I've chosen establish purpose, follow the structure of a poem, use their background knowledge, summarize, create sensory experiences, make inferences, ask questions, and monitor their comprehension. Next, you want to think about, how am I going to know the students have learned it? That is, what is going to be my evidence of learning? So here I've chose some kind of log, some kind of entry, some writing. Maybe some text annotation, some reading symbols, because they're going to be writing out their thinking. And of course, I'm going to listen in on student discussions during collaborative learning. In order for students to make those complex inferences, they're going to have to do some close reading. That is, rereading for specific purposes. That's in order to focus the reader. And I'm going to have cooperative learning structures. The goal of the 5S strategy is to give students an approach to close reading of poetry, a passage, or an excerpt, perhaps from literary nonfiction. This strategy prompts the student to analyze as they make inferences, connections, and predictions. The first S stands for sentences. Read the first and last sentence and then skim the material in between, and they make inferences. They underline important sentences in the text. They can even put a plus or minus by the first and last sentence if the connotations are positive or negative. The next S stands for speaker. So they want to read the poem and figure out who is speaking in the poem. And based on their understanding of the poem's subject, who would say something like this? So here they're analyzing the who, the point of view, and the speaker's tone or attitude. The third S stands for situation. The students here are analyzing what's happening in the poem and under what conditions would the speaker say this. So here they're figuring out what's happening. The fourth S stands for shifts. They're looking for words that indicate shifts and change in voice, tone, location, or time. And the fifth S stands for syntax. We want kids to discover the obvious syntax. That is, look for changes in length, unusual punctuation, maybe rhetorical questions. And often these lead the reader to the crucial part to understand and uncover meaning. The next strategy I want to share with you is say, mean, matter. Say, mean, matter is an effective strategy to prompt students to higher level reading. What does it say is a literal comprehension type question. What does it mean is inferential comprehension. In other words, what can we infer? And what does it matter is an evaluative question where they read beyond the lines. They connect to the outside world and they create a big picture. Here's an example of a quick little poem where you could use say, mean, matter, perhaps to model the strategy. Words Like Freedom is a poem by Langston Hughes. There are words like freedom, sweet and wonderful to say. On my heartstrings, freedom sings all day, every day. There are words like liberty that almost make me cry. If you had known what I know, you would know why. Here's an example thinking mat where say, mean, matter was used. This was a close read, which the student had to read the poem 5 to 7 times for 5 to 7 different purposes in order to pull out all of the elements. What does it say is a paraphrase of the poem with justification. I know this because. And here I'm very intentional on them providing text evidence. What is this? What does it mean? This is an interpretation of the poem, which really focuses on the way the author crafted the poem. The example reads, Langston Hughes is purposely using sensory language in order to make a comparison between sweet and words like freedom. He used like and sings to make me understand. He also used personification to help me visualize how he feels about words like freedom. And the text evidence there is, on my heartstrings, freedom sings. He feels strongly about freedom. And then what does it matter? What does it matter first deals with why the author crafted the poem in this way. Then you maybe make a connection and then reflect back on the speaker of the poem. There may be some deviations to what does it matter, just as long as the student practice and independent work leads to thinking beyond the text. Notice the text coding on the poem where the student went back to reread to find figurative language and imagery. The last strategy I want to share with you today is TP-CAST, which is another close reading strategy for analyzing the elements and structure of poetry. The T stands for title. What does the title refer to, suggest, or allude to? So that's the subject and purpose for reading. Then they paraphrase or translate the poem into their own words. Here they're looking at the poem's structure or form and how it might relate to the topic or subject. C, they're looking for connotations. They're identifying those images, those figurative language, and what the underlying connotations and feelings associated with them mean. A stands for attitude, where they're identifying and explaining the speaker's attitude or tone toward the subject of his or her poem. The S stands for shifts, where they identify important changes in the tone or voice of the poem. In T, they go back to the title again and consider, does it have more complexity than they thought at first? Or does it have different levels of meaning? And finally, and the last T is for theme. What themes does the poem explore? What questions does the poem raise? I appreciate you participating in the PLC curriculum preview. When you plan on implementing any one of these strategies, please invite me in, as I would love to come and see classroom implementation. Or if you'd like for me to come in and do a model lesson, I'd love to do that as well. If you have suggestions for future curriculum previews, please submit ideas to the email on the screen. Also, I would like to hear from you if you have an instructional strategy that you would like to showcase in upcoming videos. Finally, please be sure to submit a copy of the PLC for Reading PLC to your appropriate campus designee. Until next time, bye-bye.